My name is Jonathan Woolley. I am a Druid. I'm a member of the Order of Bards and Druids in the Ovate grade. I've been a member of OBOD for about 8 years now, and I'm also a PhD student at the University of Cambridge. And my topic of interest is the relationship between people and the English landscape. I come from the Chiltern Hills, in the county of Oxfordshire, and so I was born and bred on the chalk of the south of England. And contrary to what some witches say in fairy practice writing, chalk can indeed produce good magical practitioners. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about these two twins, in a sense, the twin themes of sovereignty and responsibility, and the twin traditions of witchcraft and Druidry. And I think that's probably what I want to say a little bit about, my commitment and what brings me to those topics. I'll pass over to you.
So I'm Theo, or G'day, you might know me by that name. I was born in Singaraja in Bali, and I grew up in Townsville and Toowoomba, and then I moved to the land of the Yagara and Turrbal people, and I've lived on Gombamberry land, and I kind of also Gold Coast area, and I've kind of spend time in Wurundjeri country, Melbourne, and kind of here, there, I go to Turtle Island a lot, which is an indigenous name for North America. And my deep passion in life is witchcraft. It's something that drives me and spells me and enchants me endlessly. I write books about it, I teach workshops about it, and it's my kind of intimate, private word that captures almost everything about me and how I feel I relate, and now how I feel I receive as well, and perceive perhaps. And I guess a lot of my passion in the past 5 years has been about, for my own self, restoring a sense of kind of what I call resonant texture to my practice, researching and being trained in superstitions and customs that come from various parts of the British Isles and Ireland, and also exploring my own. I moved back to Bali for 2 years to explore my own kind of ethnic sense of belonging to that island as well, and being surrounded by my Hindu and animist upbringing in the land that it derived from. And at the moment, what inspires me the most is what I call Aradian witchcraft, which is this kind of current that I have discerned for myself, which is this kind of revolutionary, subversive, heretical interaction with everything as a witch, as a hedge rider, as someone who wishes to enchant the collective consciousness and to reveal and resolve any hexes that the overculture might have embedded in us. That's kind of where I'm at. Cool. So the way in which this is structured, we did this talk in a 3-hour container in Melbourne, but we're only going to do a 2-hour container. But we figured out the way to kind of let that be in the landscape of our time. So Jonathan is going to speak for 20 minutes from a Druidic point of view on sovereignty and responsibility, and then I'm going to speak for 20 minutes on a witch's point of view on sovereignty and responsibility. Then we're going to have a short 5-minute break, not a long break, and we're going to come back together to have a full kind of dialogue, discussion with everyone. We want to hear from you. You might have questions, but that's not actually primarily what we're looking for. We're not trying to set ourselves as authorities. This is a Druid and a witch, and yes, we're passionate, and yes, we do stuff, but so do you. And we want to know, after we've spoken and given kind of more of a context and flavour, how you feel about these themes. And we'll kind of facilitate that and call on people to speak if you're being silent and you want to speak. But no one has to speak. And then we'll end, as always, well, I think as always, with a ritual with magic, with some kind of way to let the rest of ourselves and beings know that we have accomplished or been with something important. So we will end with prayerfulness, and we will end with ritual.
Wonderful. So, thank you. And so, without further ado, I suppose we'll go into the portion of this event where we're going to be talking a little bit about our perspectives. So I think what I'll do first is I will put on a timer so I don't run over. There we go. There'll be some chimes if I'm wittering on too long, so they'll warn me. So when we think about these twin themes of sovereignty and responsibility from a Druidic point of view, it probably helps to think about them a little bit in terms of what kind of themes they are. Now, sovereignty and responsibility are political terms, they're political concepts, they are legal concepts. Now, the political and the legal, two domains that Druids, Druidic spirituality, Druidic philosophies, have had an involvement in, an interest in, wherever and whenever they've been discussed and thought about, wherever these traditions have been, wherever this tradition has manifested. Looking at recent history, you have whether or not we're talking about George Massey's in America, his campaign against slavery, or whether or not we're talking about McGregor Reed's sort of vehement socialism and his desire to reform the rights of the worker and to raise people's awareness of environmental issues, and more recently Ross Nichols, the founder of OBOD, his equal sort of socialism and his involvement in monetary reform. Coming forward to the sorts of the anti-road protests in the UK, which many of which were led by Druids, and the movement against fracking. Druids have taken a really strongly political line and have been thinking about these questions of what is right and what is wrong, and how we can, as people who are aware of an animate cosmos around us, can develop a sense of what those things are in dialogue with our surroundings and with other beings and with the landscape. And so these themes are very important for Druids and are very key for where Druidry is at the moment. And so to think about them, I'm going to run through three particular stories, three particular accounts of sovereignty and responsibility that we see within the Western world, within the European philosophical tradition. The first two come down to us from the overculture, come down to us from kind of mainstream political theory and social theory, and are ones that I have learned extensively about in my formal academic education. But the third is going to come from a more Druidic point of view, and will stand as a critique of those first two models of sovereignty and models of responsibility that we'll discuss. So the first one is one that comes down to us from the 19th century, from Germany, but in the writing of a social theorist and philosopher called Max Weber, who wrote extensively on the notion of the Protestant ethic as being crucial to the development of capitalism, very famously. But he also wrote about sovereignty. He wrote about the formation of the state. And for Weber, he believed that the key understanding of what sovereignty is a monopoly of the means of legitimate violence. So in other words, what defines a modern state in his view is its ability to control the exercise of force within a given territory, or amongst a given people. So we see this, this particular model has profound utility for social theorists who want to understand the workings of the modern state. And you see this in all aspects of the way in which states from here in Australia all the way around the world operate, to where I'm in Britain, from the way in which the state gives permission to the police force to use violence in certain circumstances, the way in which they use armies to enforce their will internationally, to also the way in which bureaucratic regimes, and this is something written about by another anthropologist called David Graeber, are actually have this inherent logic of violence, because obviously if you don't fill in your forms very well, if you don't fill in your taxes, there's always a threat that someone with a stick is going to hit you. So this sort of monopoly over violence, this monopoly over coercion, is really very crucial within Weber's understanding of what sovereignty is. And it's the responsibility of the state, so understood, to do that correctly and to enforce that monopoly as far as is possible for it to do so, because otherwise if it doesn't, then chaos will result. It's the kind of now, the second model that we can talk about is another social theory that goes back even further than the 19th century, goes back to the very foundations of modern capitalism, and the writings of a social theorist called John Locke, who was an economic historian and a man who worked in the colonial administration in the Americas, and wrote some profoundly racist things about Native Americans, saying that they didn't manage the land effectively at all, and they just sort of drifted about gathering things as and when. Which is not accurate, or indeed a legitimate critique, even if it were accurate. But nonetheless, he pointed out that where sovereignty and responsibility doesn't really necessarily talk about it in terms of sovereignty, but he says that what gives people the right to occupy territory, to have possessions, is through this kind of ability to manage it and to work it correctly. And this is something that C.H. Macpherson talks about more broadly in European society, particularly English culture, as being this sort of possessive individualism. The fact that it is through work, the fact that it is through managing the land in a certain sort of way, that creates sort of a labour theory of ownership and a labour theory of possession. And you can see this idea has been very powerful, this idea has been very influential, and indeed it's very appropriate to speak about it here on this land, because the notion that a certain sort of work, a certain sort of management is required in order to legitimately occupy territory was profoundly what was in the minds of the colonisers and the English people who brutally came over here and illegally and immorally denied the sovereignty of the indigenous inhabitants of this land. And it was all done on the basis of terra nullius. These people are not managing this land correctly, therefore they are not exercising sovereignty. And that logic is still marshalled today in defence of the notion that there shouldn't be treaties between the Australian government on a nation-to-nation basis with indigenous peoples. So these are two models of sovereignty, two models that kind of talk about these sort of twin themes of how one can rightly exercise sovereignty and exercise responsibility in a community. One thinks about it in economic terms, the other thinks about it on more overtly political terms, overtly talking about sovereignty. Now, what you can see at the very root of these two ideas is a particular model of a way of thinking about relationships. And it's one that goes right back to an even earlier period, and that is the period of ancient Rome. Because when you look at this idea, when you think about this possessive individual, this person who possesses certain things because they manage it and they control it in a certain way, or indeed a state that monopolises violence in a particular context, what really is going on there is different kinds of domination. Right? So when a state uses violence to get what it wants, what it's doing is it's dominating people. It's kind of putting an end to the process of dialogue and conversation that normally goes on either implicitly or explicitly when people want to work together. By using violence, you can bring that process to an end. This is again sort of David Graeber's writing I'm kind of thinking of here. You can bring that process to an end and forcibly impose your will. And so there's a domination there. If you're looking at Locke's writing, the domination is between people, human people, and what are classed as objects, like things that can be owned, like the land, like resources, like trees and rivers and animals and minerals and sea and sky, and all things that can be turned into stuff that can be possessed. Right? So there's dominant, and obviously those two forms of domination can reinforce one another. You know, they're mutually constitutive. And we can kind of see one of the origins of this way of thinking if we understand the etymology, the roots of the word domination. And it comes from the Roman word for a household, which is a domus. Now, within the domus, you had a single figure, the paterfamilias, the father of the house, father of the family, who was in a position of complete domination with respect to everyone and everything within the domus, within the household. So he had, particularly over his slaves and his possessions, but also over his wife and over his children, his word was law. He could essentially say whatever he wanted. Now, of course, the reality may well have been more complicated, but that was the kind of ideology that underpinned this. There was this central figure of domination. And indeed, the wider Roman state, the wider Roman Empire, was simply a scaled-up version of this paterfamilias relation with everyone else. And indeed, through their empire, the Romans imposed that relation on ever-increasing circles of people. And, you know, as a good Druid, I'm not very keen on Romans. And we can see, actually, what you often see is that idea, that germ of how relationships should ideally work, with one person in charge and everybody else, being supplicant to them, is actually at the heart of the Roman project, and is one that you see repeated time and time again by later European polities that want to imitate the Rome and see themselves as the new Rome. And indeed, pretty much every European nation that has built an empire has done this. They've claimed that they are their kings are the new Caesars. You can think of the Russian Tsar, for example. Caesar, the German Kaiser, new Caesar, and if you look at all of the symbolism of Britain's empire, who is it who rides at the head of that, at the vanguard of that process? It is Britannia. It is the name of the Roman province. All of these, nation states, and this isn't to let them off the hook at all, are very much inspired by, in all their excesses and the atrocities they committed, were inspired by this particular idea of how the world should be, how relationships between peoples of all different kinds, be they human or non-human, should be. So what's an alternative? Now, how much time have I got? I've got 9 minutes to talk to you about an alternative. And that's good, because I've got a couple of stories to tell you, because I'm going to go back to a slightly different way of thinking. A different way of thinking about sovereignty, a different way of thinking about responsibility that you can see in some of the old stories that inspire Druids. As Druids, we're really interested in how we can, in society, we're interested in how, as we spoke about in the previous meeting in Melbourne, just as witchcraft has this orientation from the circle of firelight in which human civilization, human society takes place, out into the wilds, out into the dark, out into the shadows where the others dwell. Druidry, in a sense, is more oriented from the hedge looking into the village. How do we form a sort of a society? How do we form a way of life which is in harmony, which creates a state of peace and equanimity between the shadows that are around us and the village itself and the human centre. And the Druids have often stood, even though they've acted as hermits at times and they've gone into the forest at times, the Druids' place is often right at the heart of the political reality of a Celtic society, whether or not that's advising a king, or providing teaching, or if we're talking about bards, providing the stories that give people a sense of the structure of their history and where they're coming from and where they're going, or indeed as an ovate, someone who sits and is kind of responsible for this kind of alchemical role of transformation, providing a kind of a healing service to the community. There is that sense of being at the heart of the community. So in telling these stories, what the worth of these stories is to try and think about a way of reformulating our community. And that's one of the reasons why we were so interested, because it's only in dialogue with those who ride the hedge and head out into the realm of those others who are often excluded that we can actually truly create a state of harmony, a state of peace. And I'll be invoking peace in a manner of a version of Obod's work slightly later. So what are one of these stories? Well, you actually see an awful lot of stories about sovereignty in the British tradition. So in the writings of medieval Welsh authors, in the writings of medieval Irish authors, although they were Christian, then nonetheless there are motifs and themes that they're drawing upon from a broader cultural context, some of which have been brought in from the pagan roots in Ireland and the Celtic world, some of which have been drawn from classical influences. But nonetheless, you can see this kind of broader kind of cultural capital being brought to bear and being used to tell stories about how people should live. And one of the repeating themes that you see are goddesses of sovereignty. Sovereignty is not seen as being just a process, as an act that one does. It's a person, it's a being. And those sort of goddesses of sovereignty have to be engaged with, they have to be negotiated with in order to actively create a sustainable way of living. They can't be dominated, they can't be coerced. And there are two particular examples of this. One that I'm going to draw attention to. One is when the human peoples, the Milesians, first arrived in Ireland, first arrived in Eru, and when they were there, they met the Tuatha De Danann, the god peoples who lived in that land. And three of those god peoples, three women, were Eru, Banba, and Fodla. And these three women met the poet, I believe his name was Emergin. My Irish is terrible, so it's probably not pronounced very poorly. And they met him, and they each asked him if their name could be lent to the island of Ireland. And if he agreed, then human beings would be able to live on the island of Ireland in perpetuity. And Emergin said, yes, that's absolutely fine. We will name this land after you. So as we see today, poets haven't broken their promise. Ireland is still referred to as Eru, and indeed poets still use the words Banba and Fodla as poetic names for the land. So we are still keeping that agreement that we made all those years ago in a kind of a consentful relationship. And indeed, that act served as a basis for the later treaty that was agreed, in which the god peoples lived below the land and the human peoples lived above it. So that's one story. Another story, across the water in Wales, a country I'm much more familiar with, is of the goddess Rhiannon, when she was encountered by Pwyll, who was one of the kings of Wales, and he desired her, wanted her to be his wife, and sent various of his retainers to pursue her. She was riding on a horse, and although she was happily trotting along very slowly, they couldn't catch up with her, no matter how hard they rode. And indeed, Pwyll himself attempted to catch up with her, rode his best horse as hard as he could, and he couldn't do it. And eventually she came to him and said, "Look, I'm perfectly happy to marry you, but there are certain challenges that you need to fulfill. You just can't come over here with your white charger and expect me to just be overcome by you. You have to do what I task you with doing." In the end, he's tasked with overcoming and defeating her otherworldly husband, or otherworldly betrothed, I should say. And with her advice, I should add, Pwyll manages to do this, and he weds Rhiannon, and then they go on to have many other adventures. So again, this is an example when sovereignty is embodied and emerges through a process of negotiation and consent, where human beings engage with beings who are the land itself, who are manifestations of the landscape. And through that consentful process, through that process of relating on equal terms, that peace and a sort of a state of equanimity between different peoples is maintained. So all this sort of material gives us a real sense of a very different model of sovereignty. A model of sovereignty that is based on a continuation of responsibility. Because as I said, domination is a way of meaning you don't have to be responsible. You don't have to be responsible for the welfare of your possessions. You can just use and abuse them because they're yours. You don't have to be responsible for the outcome of the violence you do as a state, as a monarch or as a sovereign, because it's just collateral damage, right? In a sense, there's an underplaying of responsibility there. Whereas if you're engaged in these consentful negotiations, if you're constantly respecting the alterity of the people that you're talking to and their own perspective, and there's this constant negotiation, then you're constantly revisiting this question of responsibility. And there's another sort of story about this that we get from the story which is the origins of the island of Britain as a concept, that I will leave you with, and it's perhaps something we can revisit in the discussion, where we see this same principle coming up. And you can see these two different forms of sovereignty jostling, one based on domination, one based on consent, jostling next to one another in this particular tale. And I've got about 2 minutes to tell it to you, so I'll try to be brief. So, long ago, there was a group of princesses in a kingdom in Greece. And these princesses were betrothed without their consent to a series of local princes by their father, the king. And these princesses were strong-willed women and did not want to be married without their consent. And so they actually conspired to slay their betrothed on the wedding night. Unfortunately, one of their number had second thoughts and confessed to the father what was going on, to the king. He was not best pleased, but he didn't want to murder all of his daughters, so instead he exiled them. He set them on a boat, let them adrift, and the sea washed them on the shores of an island in the North Atlantic. That island was as yet unpeopled, unpeopled at least by humans. And so the women there met all the beings of the land that are described by Geoffrey of Monmouth, who writes the story down, as incubi, so demonic beings. I'm sure those of you might have understand a bit more in a more diverse, have a more diverse understanding of what those beings might have been. And these women learned how to live off the land with these beings, and they lived in harmony with that landscape, and eventually they consentfully coupled with these beings, and they rose a race of giants. Those giants lived on the island for many hundreds of years until another group of humans arrived, led by Brutus fleeing from the city of Troy. Now, Brutus, when he arrived, and his retinue rounded up the giants and executed all of them, leading, in the end, defeating their king Magog and pushing him off the cliffs in Cornwall. And Brutus, through that act of violence, now lends his name to the island of Britain. Now, we can see in this story two very different understandings of sovereignty. And one in which is based on the violent domination of Brutus, in which he slays the original inhabitants of the island of Britain, and thus places his name upon that country, and the other based on women taking responsibility and demanding that their consent be respected, and then being sent to a new place and entering into consensual relations with the beings there. Now, the point is that I think, personally, we can see Geoffrey of Monmouth is at a time in history, I think, where there was a turning from this older model of sovereignty. This is kind of me. This is not based on historical analysis, this is just me theory crafting. But I like to think that we can see within Geoffrey's these two stories, one, perhaps an older account of sovereignty, perhaps a more meaningful account of sovereignty based on consent, being overturned and overcome by a violent imperial model that hails more to Rome and its histories. So I think, ultimately, those of us in this room might look to these two stories and draw greater instruction from the one that's based on consent rather than domination.
Yay! Oh, okay. So let's just take a few breaths to cleanse our palate, but not to let go of that.
Breath is the sorbet of...
breath is a sorbet. A lemon sorbet. Okay. So we're just going to kind of swoop into the land of witches, which is a land, as I experience it, if we're going to use that understanding of humans gathering in a collective around a fire that they are tending and cooking with and using its light to crush herbs and roots and poisons and make what the community needs. There are folk who are drawn, saturated with the desire, predisposed ecologically, natively to travel beyond that fire and move in dream and ecstasy, in middle world apparition, right past that dark shadow, that hedge, that edge, and to explore mystery and otherness beyond. And so we have in Germany, and the Germanic peoples had, and I'm sure they still have, a term for these people, which is Hagazusa, and it means hedge rider. And one of the kind of most contextualizing pieces of that is that many European countries, lands, bioregions would create their villages and towns, of course, near water sources. But what they would also do is they'd craft hedges. And some of them they'd craft right out of the wild forest itself. And remembering that Europe was once utterly covered in wild forest. And the way it looks now, and the way various human-populated and human-engineered or human-damaged places on this planet look now, are so fucking different to what was once the case. Witches are the kind of people who we might remember as the ancestors of some kind of mating between shining ones, fairies who came out of hollow hills, those fallen angels who fell in love with the daughters of man, and the origins of our species, our ape-something mammalian beings that we are. So there are stories that are in various houses of witchcraft that are still perpetuated today, still told today in oral tradition, oral custom. And at the core of it is this idea that there was some marriage and bond, some deep seduction between the Most High and the Most Deep. That the deep redness and iron nature of who we are as beings on this planet seemed to attract these starry ones who were watching. Sometimes we call them the Watchers. The Grigori is the Greek word. They were watching. And indeed, St. Paul, in his epistles, would often be like, women, cover your hair in church, so lest you invoke the seductive gaze of the Watchers. Like, the early Christian fathers were terrified of women seducing these fallen angels. And this is not something that is just kept in secret witch lineages. This is something that, if you're familiar with the 1970s book Mastering Witchcraft by Paul Hewson, he wrote about this. He wrote about the Nephilim, the Watchers, and the fallen angels. So while there might be in popular culture kind of a more Wiccan-dominated story or narrative about witches, which is relevant and just as legitimate, there are other counter-narratives or intersecting narratives. So there is this idea that some witches might still postulate, and possibly is correct, the further back you go, that witches are priestesses or priests of old animistic culti that were bioregional, and they were shamanic or ecstatic, that they served their communities by speaking with the mediators, possibly the Druids, the kind of more correct priests, and then going out and seizing or wrestling with or coercing or seducing or falling in love with information and spirits that would become deeply relevant to the people who were living amongst them. And so witches and druids, I believe, and more as I have interacted with you and your kind of beautiful articulation of druidry, I kind of seem to understand that there is a intrinsic native bond between mediators and those who orator and speak and can kind of be good with the logistics of human community, and the witches who, by some other nature and ecstatic initiation, are drawn to go back and forth. And remembering that, of course, a witch is also someone who is skilled at coming back. Always skilled at coming back. There is a wonderful prototype of, I wouldn't say a caution, but maybe of a tale of that wild witch in the forest that we're all familiar with, and those of us who are witches here might yearn for. That old woman in the forest who tends her herbs and poisons, and she makes her ointments and spells, and she speaks with squirrels and ducks, and maybe not ducks, but giant megafauna elephants. You know what I mean. You know who I'm talking about. We all know that woman. And she's out there, and she's kind of a testament to, there's nothing wrong with this. If you want to, banish humanity from your life, come be with me. I'm out here in the wildwood doing my thing. Maybe that's where we'll go at the end of our lives. But witches are also those who actually have a discernible practice of coming back and making that, I hate saying the word information, but that knowledge or that intimacy or revelation relevant. Witches are practiced and artful at making it relevant. And something that I think is really interesting about your story, about Geoffrey of Monmouth's story about women from Greece who mated with giants, is that, again, in the apocryphal texts of Enoch, in the book of Enoch, we have these stories of the fallen angels who fell in love with the daughters of man. Now, that's the translated phraseology, daughters of man. Now, the fallen in love bit, or the in love bit, is actually witch storying. So they fell out of grace, apparently, and they fell from grace and they rebelled against Yahweh, the great Demiurge, the great ruler of all things, with his giant compass, penis, or whatever structures the universe. and he's looking down, and these blessed angels, led by the Lucifer or Azazel Shemiazar in the book of Enoch, are like, fuck you, God. Why are you not letting them know things? Why are you not letting them know that they are divine? Why are you not letting them reach for the stars? What is wrong with you? And so the Lucifer, which is just a Latin term meaning light bearer, in the book of Enoch, Azazel or Shemiazar, were like, oh, fuck that. And they fell. And in the witch stories, they fell in love. And it was out of love. It was risk. The Most High marrying with the Most Deep. The iron that forms in the heart of a star that spells its end, falling to be with those who carry the legacy of iron. Which is interesting because in folklore throughout Europe, there are many people who, through layering of Christianity in history, will say the fairies are the fallen angels who fell into the hills, the rivers, the sea, and the air. That's the story that keeps coming up over and over. It's not a rejection of Christianity or of its helpful language in some cases, that didn't get you killed or that let you still live in harmony with your neighbors, but using the good words of those stories in order to keep passing animistic truths and ethnic and tribal oral stories. Keep passing under the guises of saints, under the guises of, here's an interesting story from the Bible, but this is what it really means. God is a woman and she took an apple from a tree. Something of that nature. So these stories are there to remind us that even though the overculture might have gotten on top of us all and done a really good job at making us believe that we are sinful, fallen from grace, that we are broken, that we are not gods amongst gods or not holy in and of ourselves, these stories are there being passed in clandestine ways, in subversive ways, in heretical ways, and in unconscious ways to remind us that we are beautiful human divine animals, as one of my friends Raven would say. So that story is there with witches' sovereignty. One of my favourite creation stories that in modern witchcraft is one that comes out of the Edison fairy tradition. Most people in this room, whether you know it or not, would be familiar with that tradition through the spiral dance. So Starhawk, a young woman of Jewish descent who grew up in California, who spent some time in her early 20s looking for her place. She didn't find it in her Orthodox Judaism of her upbringing. She didn't find it in anything else. She met some witches. They asked her to have magical disciplines and to exercise. She was like, I don't really feel like exercising. So she, this is literally what she's written in the spiral dance. And I'm sure she'd love me saying this. And she just, went out in her car and went out into nature and lived there for quite some time. And that's how she realized she was a witch. And so she wrote this book, I think when she was 25, and it was published in 1979 on All Hallows Eve. And in the book there is this creation myth, which probably has quite, contributed quite a lot to the understanding of cosmology, the theory of how things are structured, or the experience of how things are in reality. There is this beautiful story that originates from Victor and Cora Anderson, and it's this story of this beautiful star goddess, this black mother, this divine mystery, all and nothing, and she is pregnant with herself. She is whole and complete unto herself. She is virginal. She is consummate. There is nothing else. Victor Anderson called her the clitorophallic god. And she has within herself everything and nothing. And she sees, all of a sudden, in the darkness of space, this concave black mirror, and it catches her eye because all of a sudden, out of all and nothing, there is an image. There is a divine twin. And she becomes swollen with holy lust. Holy lust. And that's what I love about this creation story, that it says holy lust. And she becomes swollen with lust for her image. And she reaches into that and she pulls herself out and they make love. And then at the peak of a series of orgasms, they explode and fly into every knowable and unknowable direction. And thus all the worlds and all the bright reign of spirits are born. And this is not a teaching of sovereignty, but what it speaks to me of is that all is natively, intrinsically sovereign. All belongs to the ground of its being. And so in some ways, the traditions and customs of the craft, we begin from that assumption. But the overculture does not begin from that assumption. In fact, it has taken the concepts of grace and the concepts of knowledge and the concepts of sovereignty and turned them into bizarre, dislocated theories that actually really impact everything, deeply impact everything in this country, in our lives, the way we form relationships, the way we discriminate against certain people for various behaviors or skin or who they are. So that idea is very foreign to the teachings of the craft as a whole. We are who we are, and we are beautiful and wonderful and terrible in that holy way, terrifying. And when we can act from that place, when we can enact from that place, we become sovereign with something else. So again, it goes back to this consenting relationship, which is to love and enshrine those stories of sovereignty goddesses. I'll just tell another story to kind of carry that through. In a lot of witchcraft houses, we have this concept, not necessarily of two gods, but of four gods. The grandmother weaver, who is very similar to that star goddess who swells up with lust. She who is old fate, she who weaves the stars together and breaks the bones and knits the souls and throws them into the cauldron and out again they go. She's the wheel, she's the stars, she's all and nothing. And then we have this grandfather, this old one, this old god. He has antlers like these beloveds. He's king of life and death. He is what the Bible would say is the Word. He is the Word. He is the God of this world, the old God of this world. And then there are two younger gods, and it almost seems like he, in his mediation between the darkness of all and the brightness of all, or whatever that mystery is, who's always there with us now, he kind of mediates between that and the other two, and he gets out of the way for the other two in a way. The other two are the ones we might be familiar with. The witch mother, or the goddess of the witches, she of the crescent crown, she of roses, she of beauty, she of love, and the master, the young god, the goat-horned god or the bull-horned god, who sacrifices himself to achieve mastery of magic. And he is there covered in any skin he wants, every skin. He is a multi-ethnic god. He travels the world, he wanders, he drinks beer with locals. People feel like they've seen him at crossroads and pay him for violin splendor. And he is the god of mastery and creativity, and he is also the god of initiation. He is the prototypical journey of the witch's initiation, of harrowing, of love, of risk, of taking the fool's leap, if you're familiar with the tarot, and being dismembered, being torn apart, so that we are sung back together if we dare to trust and lean into mystery and to our ancestors, who are the great body of the old god, who allows us to come back and revive and be one with all the world. So inside of that is a story of sovereignty. You can find that story in Keridwen and Palicien, that story, which is very I know that Obod Druids love that story. I think it's your bardic grade, right?
Yeah.
That whole story. That story is one version of witches lore. So there are places that it all intersects. Like witches are looking at the same stuff that druids are looking at all over the world. And the other thing I would say, taking me into responsibility, is that generally speaking, when we take away our agenda as religious or modern day witches or practicing witches who want to be able to practice and not be discriminated against or pushed into a corner or, do public ritual or whatever it is, write books and not have our houses burnt down, which used to happen. And in some parts of the world still does. Like even against all those agendas, there is still something that seems to be true across the board, across the world, because witchcraft is not just a European phenomenon, although it is an Anglo-Saxon term. It is a human reality. And what it is, this is what I've come to, I might change, but here is what I offer. That witchcraft is a non-sanctioned form of sorcery and intimacy with the spirits. And it has been non-sanctioned for as long as those forms of sovereignty have been in place, as long as Babylon and Sumer and all those civilizations have flourished. There have always been walls and classes, not always, but since that time, classes that have divided us. This goes here, you are worth more. Pater familias, you are going to be the archon and the king that directs and dominates and coerces things. It's because of that, witchcraft has been contextualized by that. It does not exist in a vacuum. It is a response to that, and it is an ecological response to that. We are not distanced or dislocated from ecology. We ourselves, in the great body of God herself, at least for me. And in my experience, when I realized I was a witch, it wasn't a choice, it wasn't, that religion seems lovely, it was a knowing. I knew that this shape, this story, was witch. And so I started dreaming, or I started feeling, and there was an awakening in me. And we can poetically talk about that in a number of ways that it is true. But at the end of the day, it is non-sanctioned, because there are forces in this world that perpetuate coercion, domination, and control. There are forces in this world. And we, in each of our own choice-making agencies, we navigate that. Some of us will move to a mountain and come back into the city when we need to do that work. Some of us will be in the city and furiously engage with all of that crap. And then we'll need to go to those who've made a lovely refuge in the mountain or an island. We're all doing our thing. Some of us have jobs that are very overcultural, but inside those jobs, we're kind of changing them from within. And that's really important. My mother is probably one of the best examples of a native witch, in that inside of her nursing job, which she's had for 40 years, if she sees bigotry, if she hears it, she can't remain silent. She will poke at it, and she will ask people not to be dickheads. And that is the audacity of a witch. And I can tell you that she would have been burnt as one, or hanged as one, or drowned as one, because she's an outspoken woman and she has red hair. And that was disproportionately one. Yeah, that was going to get you killed. She's also a seventh child, so she always had it. She's But anyway, so I bring that up to talk about like our sorcery is laden in the great stuff of our lives and the stuff of our death. what I love about witchcraft is when I really come across what I can feel is witchcraft is it's happening in the hearth. It's happening in the hearth hole. It's walking down the street. It's happening when people are conversing on Facebook. It's happening in the halls of hospitals. It's happening when you're on a bus. It's happening everywhere. It's happening in a graveyard. It's happening on the top of the mountain. It's happening at a pagan festival. But the thing is, it's happening in the cracks of things, and it's there to catalyze, provoke, dare, and invite each of us to pick that apple from the tree. That's what it's there reminding us, and I would like to remind us that even though the Bible never says what that fruit is, a lot of folk of European context or upbringing or ethnicity have destroyed it as the apple, maybe because there we are in Britain and there's an apple. But inside the apple, what is there? There's a star. There is a 5-pointed star. So the poetry of that for me as well is that in reaching for that delicious red fruit, that is kin with the rose, and sometimes we call the witch's mother the rose queen. We are taking, as she might invite us to, we are taking, like Eve, which means that, like the beginning, the dawn, we are taking at the dawn of our humanity what was always meant for us, which some Yahweh being or overcultural reality has said no to. No, this is not your thing. You can't have it. You must remain ignorant. Witchcraft is not about remaining ignorant. It is about discovering that we ourselves, these ones here that I can scarcely call body, these things, these ones, this contract between all my souls, is implicitly, intrinsically sovereign with, and sovereign because of all things. And I have a responsibility, therefore, because I have and will always pluck that apple, and I will eat it again and again and take that star and let it seed in me. I have a responsibility, because of my knowledge, to change things, to weave patterns. And I briefly mentioned Aradia before. Aradia is deeply important historically and culturally to the magic of revivalist witchcraft. She was there at the beginning of Gardner's writings as a Wiccan author, and she was there in 1899 when Charles Leland published that book and said, "Here is the gospel of the witches. You know, these witches in Tuscany. Here's the gospel of the witches." That book is troubling to some modern day witches because of its is that me? Does that mean it's done? I'm going to wrap it up. Because of its heresy and Christian layerings, you know, Aradia is the daughter of Lucifer and Diana. But there she is, bravely paving the way forward, and in the Aradia it says that she has come to us as an avatar of her mother to teach us the way of liberation, to teach us the way of wresting power from oppressive, well, I would say oppressive structures, but I think it's like lords and towers, poisoning the lords and towers, and of binding them with power, and of remembering the voice of the wind. That's another really part of it, remembering the voice of the wind. That if you are seeking legitimate lineage, look no further than the voice of the wind. Our Lady, the Witch's Queen, has put everything in that wind. So if you just turn your ears, you can hear the voices of those who were burnt. You can hear the voices of those who were in their huts making their spells and occasionally taking people and clients. You can hear the voices of ancient priestesses who in some strange Hibernian island were apparently reveling to Dionysus. You can hear their voices on that wind. And I urge you to. And with that, we must build the bower. And I'll finish there. And for me, the bower, the lady's bower, bringing that alive on earth once again, is the restoration of the sovereignty of risk, the sovereignty of love, and the sovereignty of desire. That those three things are the witch's end game. If we can risk, if we can be full of desire, and if we can come back to love and emerge from love, and if we can have all those three things, then we have restored on earth the bower that is the heart of this holy planet. Check. So, I am sure you are all like, ooh, interesting, maybe some of you are like, oh, or boring, but we're going to take 5 minutes and like let all of that kind of move, and then there's a space for us, and we'll facilitate it, but for us to speak and share and provoke and invite ideas. So, please, I don't know if there's, go look out there and do what you need. But we'll be back in 5 minutes. That was wonderful. Thanks. You're welcome.